Wendy, thank you so much for joining us today. Jason, thank you for being with us. Mandy, you made it. Thank you so much. Tammy, Walt, thanks for joining us. Gary and Alex, thank you. Kathy, thank you for returning back. We appreciate it. Now remember, today is about making every conversation count. So let's start thinking about the questions that you have so that we can learn how to adopt this in our everyday. Alfred, thanks for joining us. We'll get started in about another 30 seconds. Aang, thanks for joining us. Kathleen, thank you for being with us. It's good to see you too, Alfred. I love to see the chat start going. Keep chatting away. I'll be taking a look at it as well as GLLG staff to make sure that we get all your perspectives and opinions shared. Because again, it's about making every conversation count. Okay. Well, I'd like to welcome all of you, good afternoon to the Leadership in the Age of Personalization live stream. Whether you're joining us from Zoom or YouTube, I'm Glenn Yopes, and on behalf of GLLG, thanks for taking the time to just reflect, listen, and learn together. Now, we encourage you to join the Leadership in the Age of Personalization movement at ageofpersonalization.com. Subscribe to our YouTube channel and social media at Glenn Yopes, and read, watch, share our videos, articles, and Age of Personalization Outbreak podcast with your colleagues and friends. Spread the word. Be active. Be an active part of something significant. Let's redefine what leadership really means. Now, remember, today is a Q&A session. You have GLLG staff on standby who will organize the flow of the questions to ensure that you could address any of your thoughts with an open mic. And to submit those questions, please enter them into the Q&A module on the Zoom control panel. So in an ideal world, as you could imagine, every leader would be an effective communicator, but unfortunately, that's just not the case. See, leadership is not about telling others what to do, but rather maximizing one's individual capacity and preparing them for the future by being intently engaged. Intently engaged. See, making every conversation count, well, it's difficult. Beyond the need to practice patience and listen and being present, the rapid paced world that we live in oftentimes creates limitations to facilitate dialogue, stimulate thought, and maximize engagement in meaningful and purposeful ways. So to provide us guidance and wisdom to ensure that every conversation counts in the age of personalization, our guest today is Riaz Meghji. Riaz is a human connection expert. He has 17 years of broadcast television experience, and during his time as host on City TV's Breakfast Television, MTV Canada, TEDx Vancouver, and the Toronto International Film Festival, Riaz has interviewed thousands of experts about human connection and collaboration, undertaking critical training that help shape the tangible takeaways that he's going to share with us from his new book, Every Conversation Counts. Let's roll it. Riaz, welcome to the show, my man.
Hey, thank you so much. I love the production budget behind this. Look, we've got graphics, we've got music, and we've got like a worldwide audience, man. Thank you for having me in with the age of personalization.
Of course, of course. So listen, the first question I've got to ask you is what inspired the cool hair in this, your fashion? I mean, you're cool. You're just so relatable in today's age of personalization. What's going on with the hair? Because maybe I need to be doing the same thing, Riaz.
A lot of stress, man. You should have seen this hair before the pandemic. It was a totally different look, man. The funny thing about when people comment about the hair, Glenn, having worked in television for all of these years, one of my first on-air gigs was with MTV Canada. And at the time, my mother had premature gray hair. So I had, I have that genetic. Thankfully, my mother still has her hair. So we're still hanging on to these follicles, grew them myself. And producers at MTV would say, dude, you got to dye your hair black, man. You can't have gray hair on MTV. This is the channel of youth and vibrance. So I would hide the gray for years. And then it was finally when I reached 30, I just unleashed the Gandalf in me and just said, this is it, man. This is who I am. Let's just
here's the whole point, Riaz, is it with the gray hair, you actually look younger. So you're good. You're good. So in all the years of interviewing people, Riaz, who's been the most dynamic person that you've met?
Okay. I mean, that's a hard one to answer given there's been so many interviews, but I'm going to say Tom Cruise, and here's why. I was doing an event yesterday with a big insurance company here in Canada, and it was a big award show, and they were talking every single leader that won an award championed the message that success is a team sport. They were all about talking about the people that got them. They're the people that get to accept the award, but it's all about everybody else. And the one time I had the chance to interview Tom Cruise was in Vienna. And this was the Vienna State Opera House when Mission Impossible Rogue Nation came out. Yeah. And I had no idea how Tom operated. And we were on the red carpet waiting for his arrival with the stars. And there was a lead reporter from, I think it was Extra, the big entertainment show Extra. And he said, watch, Tom's going to show up 90 minutes before this red carpet begins, and he's going to be in the crowd. And it was like clockwork. He shows up, he's in the crowd, he's embracing the fans, knowing that he's where he's at because of them. And then he hits the red carpet. And here I am thinking, okay, I'm representing City TV in Canada. I better not screw this up. I better get Tom. And the reporter from Extra said, dude, chill. Watch, he's going to go to every single reporter. That movie's not going to start until he walks in the theater. And sure enough, watching how present he was amidst the chaos, he made every single reporter feel like the star on the red carpet. And sometimes when you run these red carpets, you have the publicists, they tap the star's elbow like, hey, let's move it along. Let's go. He didn't care what the publicist was doing. He was so dialed into every single conversation that even when he came to our outlet, City TV, he gave us that smile. He gave us that time. He gave us the moment. So he knew that our outlet had something special. And then he moved on. And Glenn, he was on that carpet for 3 hours, 90 minutes with the fans, 3 hours on the red carpet. And then he went in for the movie. And that whole process wasn't just an interview that stood out to me of what it means to be present, but also the respect to the people that get you to where you are. And that, when we were talking yesterday at an event about how success is a team sport, that moment, that conversation stands out to me, that it's not just about one person, it's about everybody involved.
Well, that suits us well today in the age of personalization, because in the age of standardization, people aren't present for you unless you have something to give them. And in the age of personalization, it's the other way around. So it's good that you've learned that lesson. Clearly, it's following you today with your new book, and we're going to talk about that a little bit later. But tell me a little bit about how often people mispronounce your name, because look, I've got a last name that everybody mispronounces. And the other day I was talking to someone who had another tricky name, and they've always said that they'll let anybody call them what they want. Now, why is that maybe not the most preferred approach in the age of personalization? What they told me was, hey, look, I'm not trying to disrupt anything. I just want people to accept me. But when they were actually doing the opposite, because they didn't take the time to pronounce their name the right way. So how many times is it pronounced? And do you actually use the phonetic pronunciation to help them get there?
Yeah, I definitely do. Having been a host for so many years, the opportunity and privilege it afforded was such great diversity in people that I would meet. So one of the first questions, and I credit you because right before we started rolling, you said to me, "Hey, can you? I'm going to pronounce your name. Can you make sure I'm doing it justice?" That simple gesture and that simple effort goes such a long way because I have found that your name is the most important word in any conversation.
Exactly.
And if somebody comes forward and makes that effort, and I've been intimidated by different names, thinking, okay, I'm on live television, don't screw this up, do this person justice. And I've also been on the other side where it's been an honest mistake where people have screwed up the name. But I also am aware to make that correction because it's such an important part of our identity. And if we don't correct it, we can't expect the other person to get it right. They'll think they did get it right if we don't say anything. So I make the effort, one, to make sure I'm getting it right and ask them beforehand. And if I do screw it up, just own it and just say, oh, it's not Glenn Lopez. I know it's Lopez, right? Like there's a big difference. There's stories. There's an origin of the name, and embracing that identity goes a long way to make the conversations start in the right direction.
Yeah, well, this should remind those that are participating with us today to share their own stories. So guys, we're here to help answer your questions. So maybe there's a story that you have about your name or someone that you know. So let's be part of the conversation. So let's go here. I mean, it's clear that you're a natural storyteller at a time where everybody's being encouraged to share their own personal story. But as you know, it's tough for people. What's the first step in becoming more comfortable telling your story? Because a lot of people, they're not so comfortable with talking about themselves, especially when they come from workplaces that are so indelibly steeped in standardization that it's all about the business and not the individual. But now that we're in search of that balance between standardization and personalization, we better start telling our story. So what's that first step to help someone become comfortable sharing their stories, Riaz?
Yeah, I think it really comes down to how can your story be of service and operating under a service mentality. And that takes a great deal of reflection and writing. I mean, when I have the chance to work with leaders who say, well, what if I don't have any good stories to tell? It's almost like you've shut yourself down before you've done the brain dump to understand, okay, what have I been through? What's the adversity I've navigated or overcome? And what are the transformations that came from that have a tangible teaching point that could be of service to that person listening to this story? And I think about the people you have in this room right here. They're in this conversation today about personalization, how possibly I could make every conversation count. I think about the stories that we could share in this limited time we have together today to amplify that intention they could have to say, I want to walk away from this chat with Glenn and Riaz and be more intentional in my conversations. And I heard something in that story. He said about Tom Cruise, about how success is a team sport. Bang, immediately, I'm telling you a story with an idea behind it that you can use to amplify your sense of connection, your ability to stand out. Because I find no matter what the story is or what the conversation is, people are looking for two things. They want to fit in and they want to stand out. And if you want to stand out, it's really identifying those very personal stories that take us on an arc, but give that person listening to you a tangible teaching point.
So we keep telling people that everybody has a story. Where do people start? Where do we start that journey? Because here's why I'm asking. I mean, we're living in a world, and we have lived in a world where people are constantly battling the gulf between assimilation and authenticity. They're stuck between what others want them to be rather than what they seek to be themselves. So people are often thinking that their story has to be perfect, when in the age of personalization, imperfection is more than acceptable. So give me a sense, where should they start? Should they start about their family? Should they start about their vulnerabilities? Should they start about something that may get people's attention, may surprise them about something that they've never shared before? Where do they start?
A great starting point is what is authentic to you. And
Boom.
one of the great lessons I learned early on in my television career, I remember sitting at a conference with some veteran TV people. And I was a business grad. I was going to be an investment broker. I had no experience in television when I just decided I'm going to dive in and become an intern and work my way up. And when I asked a question to a television host who'd been on TV for 15 years, I literally said, how long did it take you to get comfortable on camera? And that host smiled and he said, look, I am still figuring this out. And he said, if there's one thing I can give you is a piece of advice I can give you is always be auditioning, because you never know when someone's seeing you for the first time.
So
And
true.
that takes an important balance of authenticity and auditioning with trial and error and just trying things with your story. So where do we start with it? One, understanding what are the authentic moments in our lives. And even if you're watching this and listening to this, grab a pen and paper and take a look at the top 10 transformational moments in your life. When something happened for you, when you faced adversity personally, maybe the first time you ever did something, maybe a transition you worked through where you didn't know what the outcome was going to be and the stakes were high. Maybe a story where you surprised yourself and have a blueprint for success. Write down those top 10 stories and you will surprise yourself, because one of the greatest things I learned last year, Glenn, and even writing the book, is I'd have writer's block so many days because I would overthink the process. And my editor said, hey, man, stop thinking about this too much because you can't edit a blank page. Just put it on paper.
Yep.
Write it down, see what speaks to you and represents your identity. And then we edit it and understand how this idea, how this story, how this moment could be of service to a reader or a listener or a viewer that's watching it and hearing it and feeling it through the screen.
That's perfect. Great advice. Now, I know, Alfred, you're active on that chat room. If you're ready for an open mic, let us know, because I think what you're talking about is going to apply to a lot of people. Now, we're in this world now where everybody's having so many different conversations. In fact, one of our team members here at GLLG, in fact, he's our director of marketing and strategy, Guillermo, said, Glenn, everybody's talking about all these different things, but what are the right conversations? So that's my question for you. When do you know that you're having the right conversation? Because we seem to be getting so distracted with all of this news, the internet. We're headed towards, a phase of business recovery. Society is about ready to open up again, or it's slowly opening up depending upon where you're at in the world. But what are the right conversations? And when do you know when you're part of the right conversation? So one is, how do you know the right conversations that you can create? But when do you know that you're actually in the right conversations yourself with other people? Big question.
Yeah, that is a fascinating one. I mean, the first thing that comes to mind when you ask me about the right conversation, I think about the idea of, well, how am I leading with my curiosity to understand what's the conversation, the person in front of me? If I'm looking at the example of one-on-one, the conversation that the person needs to have right now. And one of the simple things that I would always ask in the green room with people I would interview is, I would do all of the research to understand, okay, what's the topic? What's the theme? What's the intention? We have 5 minutes. We have 7 minutes. It's live. What are we going to get across? What's the choreography? But most importantly, the question I would throw out to people is, so what's on your mind? And the first answer they would give me allowed me to understand what the priority is for them. Because in this era, when there's so many conversations happening, we're bombarded with information. It feels literally impossible to break through the noise that exists by simply taking a pause on talking and making the priority for me to listen before I'm talking and asking questions like, what's on your mind? That allows me to understand that's the conversation that person wants and needs to have right now. And it's less about what I'm saying and more about how my courageous curiosity can unlock what that person is doing. Because I find the biggest challenge right now with conversations is our intention to fix it before we feel it. And if we feel where they're at, that's where these breakthroughs can really happen. That's where trust happens, where someone can say, yes, Glenn is exactly in the place where I'm at right now. He's following me through this. That's what I need right now. And that's what I think we need, a culture of acknowledgement before we just come busting through the gate of, here's the idea, here's the conversation. It's, are we truly listening to each other?
On that note, let's listen to what Alfred has to say. Alfred, are you ready to get on the open mic?
Sure. Am I on now?
You are. You're live.
Great. So Glenn and Riaz, this I can't state enough how significant this conversation is that you've provided the forum for. And so my question to you, Riaz, is in this time of pandemic and protest and poverty of hope, how would you speak to the significance and the importance of having these conversations, even with the unrest, to having those difficult, courageous conversations, and most importantly, to know when to listen, as you were just talking about, when to just ask someone, what is it you need from me in this conversation, before I even say a word and try to heal you? Can you speak to that, Riaz? And then world peace, if you have a chance, can you do world peace? I'm teasing.
Thank you, Alfred.
Hey, if we conquer world peace in this hour, I'd be like, your personalization is going viral, man.
I had to say,
Alfred,
because you look like you were ready to answer the world peace too. Go ahead. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Alfred, that's awesome, man. Thank you so much for the question. And Glenn, I'll jump in with that idea of this great divide that we're living in and the polarization that happens. I think emotion can take over and we get distracted by our emotions. And one of the habits I really champion when it comes to difficult conversations is leading with assertive empathy. And this really involves relationship first, logic second. And if we're going to champion and prioritize the relationship we have with people, even if we disagree with someone, how do we simply acknowledge them? We're so quick to interrupt. We're so quick to give unsolicited advice. We're so quick to challenge the idea. We miss out on the idea of prioritizing relationship. So the conversation becomes a confrontation rather than a productive collaboration. And I think it starts with acknowledging each other, hearing that point of view, recapping that point of view to confirm we understand it. And then when emotions get heightened, that's a responsibility on us to really own our emotions. And I found the University of Wisconsin, they had a great piece of research on difficult conversations that came out. This was like maybe 6 or 7 years ago of, well, how do we create a safe space when emotions are high, we're getting frustrated, we can feel we're getting emotionally distracted because of a potential disagreement. And they really championed the idea of using I statements. I'm getting frustrated. I'm feeling disconnected, or, I should have known better, Alfred. And we can even use that with their curiosity and think of the questions of, how could I show up for you more, Alfred? Or Alfred, what's the question I failed to ask in this situation that would really understand your situation? And once we've done that and prioritized the relationship, it almost starts to disarm the tension that could exist, because the first thing we're asking when we meet somebody is this a friend or is this a foe? And when they know this is a friend and we've prioritized relationship, that's the opportunity to bring in logic and then focus on what we can agree on. So I could say, Alfred, so what is the real challenge that exists for you here? What does your ideal scenario look like? What would it take for this to work for you? And then we start to work on collaborative outcomes where you see me as a friend that, he's on my side and it's you and me versus the challenge instead of me versus you and this polarized climate we're living through.
Fantastic.
As for world peace, just Google world peace. I'm sure there's other solutions.
Right. But that was fantastic. Thank you. And so clearly and succinctly put, you don't always have a lot of time in these situations. To do that simply and clearly, it's fantastic. Thank you.
Awesome, man. Thanks for the question, Alfred.
Yeah, great question, Alfred. It's interesting, Alfred, because what you were able to ignite with that type of a question was this insight that Riaz gave us about disarming the tension. And I'd like for you to go into that a little bit deeper, Riaz, because I think oftentimes when people feel the tension, this is where they lose the opportunity to build the relationship. So something's got to give. And I only share that because in today's age of personalization, we're learning that these two forces of standardization, old outdated standards that define the individual, in the age of personalization, where the individual's now helping define and influence our path towards solving for and contributing to the mission, where these two forces need each other, but yet we're operating at the extremes. And so something has to give. And right now, I feel that what people aren't willing to let go of is maybe this false reality that there's something so important about themselves that they can't let go of. And maybe that's feeling this sense of relevancy that they have by living in the extremes or acting in the extremes rather than letting go, so that we can find where we can meet people where they're at. And we keep talking about this, meet people where they're at. How can you even know if you don't let go?
Yeah,
What do we do? What are your thoughts?
It's letting go of the ego, step one. And if we want to meet them where they're at, it's being courageous with their curiosity and the questions that we're asking that doesn't shy away from an intensity or an emotion. I'll give you the example of, think about the grief conversation going on. And sometimes people could shy away from it thinking, okay, I don't want to trigger this person, so I'm not going to ask that important question to understand where they're at. Think about why small talk is something people dread. Small talk has become this defense mechanism to prevent ourselves from the embarrassment of getting emotional in front of someone we don't know. And I think it's getting real with letting go of the ego and having the courage to ask the questions that are pertinent to that person. Because there's no way we could understand where they're at unless we lead by listening, unless we lead by that curiosity that's going to start to unlock these roadblocks people are experiencing. And I've found that there are three key questions that we're all asking ourselves, especially if it's the first time we've met somebody, especially if we're trying to decipher, are they a friend or foe? And those questions are, do you care about me? Are you listening to me? And can I trust you? And if we keep those questions in mind, and we can lead to answer those, to do the work, to show somebody we care, to lean in with courageous curiosity, to show them that we listen, and to go first with something real, vulnerable, and authentic ourselves to show, hey, I trust you. That'll help disarm that tension to say, okay, I can trust Riaz too. He's trusted me with something personal. I can reciprocate that trust.
So Riaz, I have to come back and say, is this about courage or is this about self-trust? And you may say, well, gee, Glenn, they're kind of one of the same. I feel that standardization has limited people to the point where they don't even know themselves anymore. And so if you don't know who you are, the contributions that you can make, the value that you could add to any conversation or situation, then why in the heck would you have the courage to do it? So to act. And so I just asked the question because I feel that, especially during this pandemic that has opened us to understand the things that really matter to us, we're still questioning our place in this chaotic space that we live in now. Any thoughts there?
Yeah, I think there are two very powerful components with courage and self-trust. And, I'm looking at Alfred typing in, today's question is not, how are you doing? It's how are you really doing? Another great question to add to this is even to flip it and not just how we're doing, but on a baseline with self-trust and understanding who we are is, well, how are you taking care of yourself?
Yeah.
How are you making time for yourself? Because in this culture of standardization, one of the things that's happening is we have a fear of saying the wrong thing, a fear of alienating ourselves, and a fear of disappointing others. And if that's the leading priority, what are we going to do? We're going to end up disappointing ourselves. And that's why people pleasing is a big challenge. If we're saying yes to everything,
right,
what are we saying no to? Ourselves. And that's where standardization meets personalization. So I think it takes a great deal of courage to do the work to understand, well, what's important to us? How can I get clear on what my contribution is? And then how can I tactfully and leading with empathy, challenge the norm and introduce new ideas. So we're having productive disagreements. Because if we're not having productive disagreements and we're just going along with the standard approach, nothing will change. No innovation will happen, and the conversations will become forgettable.
This reminds me of a conversation I had yesterday with an emerging leader that says, our organization keeps talking about all the things that we're doing with our employees. And she said, but I can't visibly or physically see those changes. So we have an open mic now with Pete. Pete, thanks for your question. Great question. Please share your question on the open mic with Riaz.
Hi, Glenn. Hi, Riaz. My question is just, as a leader with many years of experience and expertise in your field, how do you balance giving advice to those you're leading and sharing your knowledge with them with stepping back and simply allowing the group to function without your interference?
That's so good. And I think that leans into the idea of if you're a leader and you try to fix everything and then you step away and then you can get frustrated saying, why can't they just do this for themselves? And then it's the recognition that I'm doing too much. I think it's an opportunity to ask the question. And one of the most valuable questions, Pete, to speak to this is, and this is a great relationship question, is what is it like being on the other side of me? And that is a big question to ask, whether that's your partner, whether that's one of your good friends, whether that's maybe a team that you're managing. But that level of awareness and that answer, that honest answer, would allow us to begin to understand, okay, here's how I'm showing up. And that honesty they can give me, and that takes killing the ego, because that answer may be tough to hear, to understand, how am I showing up for my team? Am I doing enough? Am I doing too much? And then once that's determined, that's the opportunity to find out, well, tell me, what does support look like for you?
Great
and
job.
then determining
Go
what
ahead.
they need.
So, as you're speaking and I'm thinking about what Pete said, this reminds me of something that I've always said, Pete, to people that are seeking advice. I always say, look, I will never provide anybody advice if it's something that I've never done or experienced myself. And look, not every leader has all the answers. And oftentimes, especially in this age of personalization, they're new to witnessing new things that they've really never, so they don't have as much advice as they did in the age of standardization, where everything's been so templatized. You could just say, whoop, I'm going to go to this file here in my brain. Yeah, I did that 30 times before. I'll just give them that piece of advice. But now that it's about the individual, it's a different type of advice. So, we find trust in those that can relate to the things that give us pain. And if we can use that as an opportunity to further elevate and build a more intimate relationship that now allows us both to share our own personal stories, that now gets us to understand each other and get to know each other, that's really the opportunity. So look, I'm really encouraging questions. I know that you're all mesmerized with Riaz, as I am, but okay, boom, here's another one. This one is from Jason Forbes. Jason, thanks for putting in a question. Love your question. Please turn on your mic and ask Riaz.
Hey, Riaz, how are you today?
Jason, what's going on, man?
Oh, not a lot. Just enjoying this Q&A session here. Thanks for hosting this here, Glenn, as well.
You're welcome.
On the question here, in the world of Zoom meetings, when striking up a conversation with a client or a prospect, what are some of your ideas of being present, especially when you feel you are a better communicator in a personable setting rather than on Zoom?
Now, you address this in your book, Riaz. Fire away.
Yeah, the idea of Zoom provides a brand new distraction. And I think step one, Jason, is kind of forgetting about yourself in the Zoom setting. And what I mean by that is, anytime I'm doing a Zoom meeting, my self view is off. I don't want to be distracted by what I look like, how I'm gesturing, because anytime we can see ourselves, we'll always be distracted by how we look. So step one, remove the initial distraction. Step two, the intent is consistent with the idea of curiosity. And in these Zoom meetings, they provide such convenience and efficiency with how we meet. We don't have to drive anywhere. We just click a button, bang, here we are. We're up, we're talking. But the thing that happens is we almost move too fast. And convenience turns out to be the enemy of connection, because we forget to have that check-in. And I encourage people to not miss out on that moment when that call starts, to talk about the things that contain personal emotion, and connect with people of, tell me about, your career, your health, and above all, your relationships where emotion lives. And that connection point right off the top is an important one. And then just leading with the curiosity throughout. I find some of the most successful calls I have are the ones where I don't say as much. And they could say, hey, I really like that person. I really like that Riaz guy. And it wasn't because of something I said. It's because of the space I create in the Zoom meeting, in the Zoom conversation, to just learn about them and explore that. And they walk away feeling like he cares. He's listening to me. Yeah, I want to further the conversation and see where it could go. So I think it's removing the distraction of seeing yourself, not forgetting about the emotional check-in right off the top to establish that human connection, and then just leading with the curiosity and finding those uncommon commonalities that maybe we could discover beforehand of, like, look, when I met Glenn, we had a friend in common. And we had an interesting story of our families coming to America and coming to Canada and what that struggle is, and bonding on those human elements before we ever talked about, hey, how do we collaborate and do business together?
Yeah, that's a great point. And, I think you just hit it right there. It's, allow these Zoom sessions to start with you as an individual, so that we can understand kind of what our state of mind is before we actually jump into things. I mean, let's face it, we're bombarded with Zoom. In fact, I think somebody said we have Zoomatosis on chat. And so the question becomes, how do we find our space and our comfort before we actually get into what we were there to have a conversation about? So I love this, Riaz. We have another question now. This is from Walter. Walt, you've got the mic. Well,
there we go. I had to click the unmute button. So I love the term assertive empathy, or leading with assertive empathy, which implies a lot. But the question I have is, how do you learn to do it? And maybe more importantly, how do you teach it to others?
Great question, Riaz.
Yeah, really good. Some people will say, well, how aren't these two polar opposites, to be assertive and to be empathetic? How did I learn to do it and champion this idea? I'm going to sound like a broken record on this, but it really came into the idea of less of what I can say, more of what I can learn and extract from the person in front of me. So step one was to maintain a beginner's mindset. And that really involves the idea that in a beginner's mindset, there are infinite possibilities of what I'm relaying could mean, or how they could react. And the thing I've learned is you can't talk somebody out of being bothered. It takes a great deal of patience. It takes a great deal of humility, and it takes a great deal of practice. And to this day, it's understanding that everyone is going to have a unique reaction. But the thing that I'll always be able to control is the energy and the intention I'm bringing to it with the idea of empathy. And the assertiveness really comes into the notion of staying consistent to it, even if I'm met with a heated reaction, not elevating to that intensity where you lose that opportunity to achieve something that's productive and help disarm them. Because what's happening right now is, if we see somebody else have a heightened or intense emotional reaction, our defense mechanism says we have to go big too. Fight or flight kicks in, and then it's me versus you. So I think it takes a great deal of practice. And then that method of how you teach it to somebody, I don't think you can teach it to anybody unless there's a willingness for them to want to embrace that approach altogether. And the notion of teaching it, to me, is just role modeling it. If they see you as the leader showing up in a way where there is such an assertive point of caring and empathy, that is the best teaching mode or model to show off, because it's leading by example. You can give somebody the theory, but if they see you in a space where you can navigate it and disarm somebody, I think that's the best teaching model for this. It's just to lead by example.
So thank you all. Again, we highly encourage you all to ask your questions. I know a few of you that's in this room, so I know that the intention is there. Now, I want to go to your book, because you've actually talked a lot about many things that are in your book. Every conversation counts, Riaz. But part of what you talk about in, the 5 areas of human connection, the 5 habits, is that we need to put aside our perfect persona. Can you dive into that? Because again, I think this kind of goes back to what I mentioned before, that we're at the extremes because everyone's trying to hold on to what may be their perfect persona when maybe it's not. I mean, what's your take on this?
Imperfection is such a point of relatability. And that is the biggest point that I wanted to double down on with this habit in the book. And this came to me with a conversation I had with Darren Hardy, who is a great mentor to many CEOs around the world. I love his book, The Compound Effect, that really talks about consistency to achieve success in your life. And when I had the chance to talk to Darren a few years back, I watched him for 2 days, ignite an audience. I know he's interviewed some of the greats in the world. And when I sat down with him, I said, Darren, what is the secret to getting people to open up and establish this point of relatability so we have trust, so we have, deeper rapport and relationship? And he kind of smiled and he said, there's 2 words that stand out if you want to put aside this perfect persona and if you want to connect. And he said, go first. And I thought about that and I said, okay, go first. Well, tell me about that, Darren. And he said, if you want to motivate somebody, go first and find out what motivates them and help them achieve that. He said, if you want someone to trust you, go first and show you trust them and reveal something real, raw, and candid in your own life. And that's where that realness, that's where that imperfection comes in. And as I would do a deeper dive on this idea of imperfection, what happens is that vulnerability becomes this buzzword where somebody comes crashing in the door out of the gate, and they could be a complete stranger giving you this high degree of vulnerability. And you're at the point where, well, you're like, oh, hold on, this is an overshare. I don't know you yet. And you're unleashing this on me. And when I would research this, I found there was a psychological term known as the pratfall effect that promotes the idea in psychology of credibility before vulnerability, where if we can convey our strength and credibility, that share, if we're seen as that point of authority, that openness, that share, that imperfection becomes such a valuable tool to develop quick set intimacy and draw somebody closer. But if they're already questioning our competence, or if they don't know who we are, if we come slamming through the door with that imperfection and vulnerability, it can be interpreted as an overshare and create a greater divide instead of bringing people closer together.
I don't mean to get controversial here, and I promise I won't, but I'll just throw this out. I think this is what people are being challenged with right now around diversity, equity, and inclusion. The vulnerability comes out before we establish ourselves. And that then creates a barrier rather than a bridge to the right conversations. How's that for a little boom, mic drop? So we're going to come back to Alfred and Pete. Alfred, you got a question, another question, and then Pete, you can follow. Go ahead, Alfred.
Yeah, there was an earlier point I was wanting to stress, and that was the intent versus impact. How we need to be very conscious of what we intended to do and the impact that we actually have and unintended consequences, and being able to stay for several conversations or accept non-closure. That's really one of the points. And the other was often I think we underestimate our abilities to listen or to be heard or to understand. Yeah. And that limits the conversation from ever happening.
Thank you, Alfred. Thank you for that. Did you want to comment on that?
2 great points.
Riaz?
Yeah, I think we put a lot of pressure on ourselves of, are we listening enough? Are we asking the right question? And I think it's just letting go of perfection in that. And if the intent is pure to be in there, every conversation that I'm going to have on camera, or every conversation I'm going to have, I'll always ask the question of, how was that for you? What was the most useful thing for you in that conversation, so I can continue to learn? And it really goes back to having that beginner's mindset, as opposed to just being the expert, whether you're limited by, the options that exist. So I think that's a very valid point of that Alfred's making, of the pressure we can put on ourselves that almost acts as a distraction, because we're thinking, I've got to do all these things, but it's just being there, keeping it simple, getting to the point. And then once it's done, evaluating, how could I show up even more the next time out?
You know what I really like, and you've said this a second time, and I think that this is a whole other show within itself, is this concept around the beginner's mindset. I love it because, let's face it, we're all starting over again. And so if we don't have that mindset, how are we going to know how to find ways to reinvent ourselves? I mean, I don't mean to hit the siren right now, but I hope everybody recognizes that a day of reckoning is coming. And that doesn't need to be negative, that the avalanche is going to fall. All of these different changes are going to come pummeling on us. And are we prepared? And what's defining our level of readiness and preparedness as we move forward. So I love this concept, and I think it's one that is very simple, and one that I think really you need to ask yourself, how much do I really know? And I think the pandemic has taught us and continues to teach us that maybe we knew what was important for me to know, for what I needed to know before the pandemic, but now after the pandemic, do I really know what I need to know to be an influential and or significant contributor to what it is that we're in the business for? And I think this is a question that we all need to be reflecting on. So I really like that beginner's mentality. Thank you for that. Or mindset. Is it mentality or mindset? One of the same, right?
Either or.
Well, I want to respect your content. Come on, Riaz. So listen, we're going to go to Pete right now. Pete, thank you for asking a follow-up question. Fire away.
Yeah, thank you. And Glenn, you brought up the last two times you spoke, you brought up two good points. One about the diversity, equity, and inclusion, and this next one about this day of reckoning that's going to come out. Things aren't going to be normal. And I've actually been doing some reading recently about a leader's role in managing diversity and inclusion. And Riaz, one of the main things I've been taking away from hearing you speak today is that it's in this age of personalization, it's crucial to create a culture built on trust. And and especially going forward, one of the renowned social thinkers, social theorists, Richard Rorty, wrote something about how we need to emphasize fraternity if we want to actually grow as a society and become a better society. And that's just anything is trust. So I want to ask you if you have any specific tips to foster trust in a group setting, or maybe even on a bigger setting, just with everyone you meet, just this sense of trust and fraternity with interpersonal relationships.
Yeah, I love this. I love where we're going with this, Pete. And I think to support an idea or a takeaway out of this really goes back to, if I'm a leader on that call and there's 20 people, there's 50 people, there's 100 people, and I'm seen as that point of authority, is to lead by example and go first. Those two words that Darren Hardy gave me about putting aside the perfect persona, they go a long way. And I'll give you an example of what's happening right now in this culture and this reset that we're talking about. A lot of employees are being onboarded in a remote work setup, and they're not having the traditional touch points to build these bonds and feel a part of a high trust culture. And they're feeling a lot of stress. And if I'm a leader on that call, knowing that I've got some new recruits on this Zoom meeting, even if it's a big meeting, I'm going to lead off and say, you know, on my first day at this company, here's what I was stressing about. And it infuses this showing of humanity, infuses this realness and connectedness of that remote on the other side. That new recruit's going to feel like, okay, I could take a sigh of relief here because I'm feeling the exact same thing. And he sees me. He hears me, he acknowledges this is the challenge we're having, and I can speak up about it as opposed to hide it because I'm going to alienate myself to this new group. So it's right now, leadership, personalization, and building rapport coming down to leading with that realness. If you're that point of authority, show them. It's okay to show your humanity because that's what we're going to need. And virtual is not going away anytime soon. And that humanity will be a huge, huge tool for high performance.
Well, and that's a great point, Riaz. And, this is what the challenge is right now, is if we keep operating at the extremes of standardization and personalization, we're actually weakening our humanity. And so it's funny, earlier it was brought up in the chat. I know we discussed it a bit. It was, how are you doing today? And this goes back to your question, Pete, with the group, or how are you really doing? I mean, I can remember the numerous times I just started to get bothered by when you ask somebody that, well, I'm great, I'm doing this, I'm doing that. So one day I went into Starbucks. I went to, I was in this long line again, pre-pandemic. And I asked somebody in front of me, how are you doing today? Oh, I'm doing fantastic. I go, really? Are you really fantastic? Because I'm not. So what are you doing that's making you so fantastic so that I can learn from you? Oh, well, my son is having this and all of a sudden the guards came down, because in the age of standardization, you have to be perfect. We talked about that earlier. But in today's age of personalization, we're learning, and especially if we haven't learned this from the pandemic already, we all have problems. And the truth is, like my dad told me when I was 16 years old, don't let anybody ever fool you. Everyone's got problems. And I think that there's something powerful about recognizing that we have so much more in common with people than we really even know, because it takes so long to get to the core of what's really on people's minds. And it's incredible just how much we can contribute to someone's life, let alone a team who's feeling that pressure to deliver on those metrics that, by the way, oftentimes don't really matter. I had to
So,
pause
you know
there
what?
because- so anyway, go ahead,
That's-
Riaz. I'd like for you to comment on what I'm talking about here.
Yeah, it's quite powerful, because what you're articulating, what I'm hearing, is that it really speaks to how uncertainty became our universal commonality in this past year. And pre-pandemic, we would have so many conversations of convenience. You think about the surface level conversation you could have at the water cooler, or maybe just hanging out at your kid's soccer game and sitting on the sidelines shooting the breeze. But what this idea of and reality of isolation and loneliness has done to us has made that uncertainty turn into the psychological struggle being top of mind for everyone. And to get real with, you're not just how are you doing, good, and missing what's really going on with people of, you know what, tell me your high, tell me your low of the past week. And, let's get into it, and practicing specificity to move past superficial formalities is invaluable right now to speak to the personalization, because that psychological struggle is real. And if we give people the space, the safe space to be seen and to share, and it's not just some BS question we're throwing out, yeah, I don't really care how you're doing, to really lean in, to understand what they're going through, they're going to remember that. And
No
those
question.
bonds, once this is over, will make a world of difference to be like, Glenn cares about me in this culture. And they're going to remember when they were at their crossroads of how you were there for them. And every time you ask that, instead of just asking, how are you doing? Let's get specific with it. Like, tell me about a high, tell me about a low this past week, and allow people to share something meaningful.
I love that point. And when you said we need to give people the space, here's one for everyone. We need to give them the time. What do I mean? Well, it's obvious what time means, but it means that you're going to have to make more time for people than ever before, ever. I can tell you, you may see Sandy. Sandy's on our team, a very special member of our team. And fundamentally, when we get on the phone, I ask her about her weekend. She asks her about mine. I start sharing my problems. She starts sharing hers. We're on the phone, Sandy, for half an hour before we get into the things that we asked that we wanted to talk about. But this is the way we start our week. We talk about what's on our minds. We talk about the things that is going on in their personal lives. We talk about the things that matter before we jump in to the things that really don't matter. Because the truth is, work is easy. Life is hard. And these two things are really interconnected. Now, we have one more question. We've got 6 minutes. I've been given the 6-minute warning. We got one question with Dan. Dan, I'm going to ask you to get on the mic. But hey, look, I know that Wendy's out there and Bill's out there and Gary's out there. I'd love to take one more question after Dan if we can. Dan, thanks so much for joining us. Fire away.
Yes, thanks for having me. This has been a really great conversation, so I appreciate it, and thanks for the time. So, technology, social media, political divide, and of course, this pandemic has put a serious strain on community, right? So, we're at the risk of losing our neighborhood relationships. We no longer care for our neighbors. So how do we get back to that place where we care for our neighbors, regardless of their position? Everything seems so divided, right? The Yankees, Red Sox, blue, red, Jets, Sharks. If you're not with me, you're against me. How do we break that cycle so this way we get to humanity first, right? And I think that's something that's really in danger. And so you've been so insightful so far, and I'd really love to hear your thoughts about that.
Now, if I may interject here, Riaz, just to put your work into practice, and that was a great question, Dan. What matters to Dan? What do you think matters to Dan based on that question? Riaz, what do you think matters to Dan?
The divide that exists right now, and the perhaps apathy that's going on with how we're not living in solidarity. We're just living our own lives with convenience and just getting by without community.
So the reason I asked that question is that, Dan, this is a great example. And that's why I've always respected your leadership, Dan. So thank you for asking such a profound question, because we know what matters to Dan just by that question alone. So give people the room to ask questions. And much like Riaz says, when you go first, others will follow. But keep going, Riaz. How do you want to address Dan's question?
Yeah, that is such an important one of how we do this. And Dan, I'm going to personalize it and think about the community of just, I live in a condo here in downtown Vancouver, British Columbia, and we've had a couple of people, older people on our floor have COVID. And you know how isolating this is completely. Having seen them is the consistency on our part to reach out to them, because it's easy when you think, you have it, I don't want it, I'm going to keep to myself, you figure it out. But knowing that, okay, our community is our floor and we want to look out for each other, how do I help bridge that gap is really being purely intentional with reaching out. Somebody's got to lead this.
Right.
If we are completely apathetic to say, and this is what I think has happened with our culture right now, technology has made things easier. Technology has made things convenient. And we started this conversation today, and I mentioned the idea that convenience is almost the enemy of meaningful human connection. Instead of just an email or a text, if you can't physically be in the space, send them a video message. Find out what they need and be intentional with how we can support. And that really starts with us and the efforts we make to look out, not just for ourselves, but for other people. And it doesn't just have to be leadership within an organization. How can we show up as leaders of human connection with the community in our building, with the community at our daycares, with the people that, you know, that could be our friends or our loved ones, to check in with them. It's easy to just think everybody is just working it out. It's fine. But I think the greatest thing I've learned during the pandemic is people, when they reach out to me, they may be looking at me and coming to me for more than I think they need. And it's not a guessing game anymore. I will check in with them, and not just how are you doing, to understand where they're at, what they need, what support looks like for them, and what is a fitting contribution of what I can do. And just being conscious of that. And that takes effort. That takes intention.
Yeah, great. I appreciate that. Thank you.
Dan,
Thanks for the question, Dan.
Thank you. Now, it's my fault, Guillermo, if we're going a little bit long, and I want to apologize to everyone, but we have two great questions here. Let's start with you, Wendy. The mic is yours.
Okay, thank you. Your comments just now, Riaz, on leadership is really important. Everybody that's on this call cares a lot about being a leader. Is there some simple one-word answer you could give me if I said, what is the most important characteristic or value that we have as being leaders to help this transition to really seeing people?
The one word, Wendy, that comes to mind out of everything we've talked about today is the curiosity piece, because curiosity leads to empathy. Curiosity leads to understanding. And once people feel seen, heard, acknowledged, it disarms tension, and it gets us to relationships that are really going to drive results. Because we talked about this notion when Glenn asked me, of all the interviews I've had, is that notion, sure, Tom Cruise is a superstar, but how success is a team sport, and how we get to successful outcomes really comes down to curiosity and the quality of questions we can ask. Some people will say, hey, people aren't talking enough, and the answers aren't great. Well, how do we level up the quality of our questions to allow people to feel seen, heard, motivated, that people care, and they're motivated, that we want to see them succeed?
This goes back to one of the fundamentals of leading in the age of personalization. Do you see me? Do you know me? Do you see me? Do you know me? Unfortunately, a lot of people don't feel seen, and they don't feel known because they don't feel anybody's really listening or paying attention or even think that they're worthy. So final question comes from Bill. And Bill, thank you for your question. I'm going to read it. He's unable to get on the mic right now. On the other hand, social media is also building new bridges for people who are marginalized in their own contexts and neighborhoods. Riaz, what advantages do you see in social media for fostering authentic communication? Thank you so much, Bill.
Social media is always going to be this double-edged sword. And I'll credit the work by the late great pioneer of loneliness research, Dr. John Cacioppo, who said, how do we curb this challenge of loneliness that existed well before the pandemic began? And it really was creating more face-to-face connection. Simple baseline, more face-to-face connection. Because here's what's happening with social media. For the most part, we're getting caught in echo chambers where our communities are just agreeing with ourselves. And then if there is a great idea that challenges our ideology or belief, people might be quick to block them out altogether, which you would never see happen in a physical meeting. You'd say, let's have the discussion. Let's have this healthy debate. So if we can promote face-to-face and see each other through social media, and you see more people going live on Instagram, look at us using the vehicle of Zoom to connect like this face-to-face. And I love the fact we're hearing voices, not just reading chat boxes on this, Glenn. So kudos to the team. It's really being intentional with creating more face-to-face and not passively scrolling, not passively liking, but being intentional with engagement. If someone's going to write that comment, Glenn, you've done this beautifully, recognizing the people here, allowing them to be heard, allowing us to share some insights that can hopefully serve. It is truly the art of intention to not just passively engage in social media where you'll fall into a trap of a culture of comparison, and then you feel more inadequate and more insecure and more isolated, but saying, I see you, I'm curious about that. And then there's a healthy back and forth. And if we can do that face-to-face, even better.
Riaz, you were great today. I greatly appreciate how you've contributed. You've left us with words and stories that make us think. And I'll tell you what I'm leaving with today. It's the same thing that I learned when I was a kid from my father. It's all about people. It's all about people. And if we can't find ways to coexist in this world of mass variances, we got a lot of work to do. But what I know to be true is that we're all eager for it. But to get there, we need to find ways for these two forces of standardization and personalization to coexist, because it can't just be about one or the other. It needs to be about both. But it all begins with the individual. Riaz, any final comments before we leave?
Final comments. Thank you. Thank you for allowing this message to come into your important world of the age of personalization. I have a great deal of respect of how you're leading and championing this idea to allow people to be seen. And as a final message, to kind of sum up what we discovered is, if you're walking away from this conversation, just think, how do you break out of your autopilot mode from day to day of how we're communicating right now? And what's one thing you could do to be more intentional, to reach out, whether that's going first, whether that's leading with courageous curiosity, whether that's just being an incredible listener, to just be where people are. And that takes intention to break out of autopilot mode. And I hope we've given you something that could help you do that and help your relationships thrive.
Thank you, Riaz. And as I always leave our audience with, in the age of personalization, you will see things that others don't, do what others won't, and keep pushing when prudence says quit. Have a great rest of your day, everyone. And thank you for joining us.
Thank you.